A luxurious yacht, the Seraphina, glides through the moonlit channel, its decks alive with champagne and secrets. But when Tycoon Lionel Brent vanishes overboard after a heated argument, the glittering party turns deadly. Was it an accident or murder? Enter Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster whose gentle demeanour hides a razor-sharp mind. As tensions rise among a scheming widow, a vengeful heiress, a secretive captain, and a nervous deckhand, Miss Marple unravels a web of greed and betrayal. A missing shawl, a smudge of red paint, and a hidden grudge led to a shocking truth. One guest's rage pushed Brent to his doom. In this Agatha Christie-style mystery, no secret stays buried for long. Chapter 1. The Invitation. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where the seasons turned with predictable grace and the gossip flowed as steadily as the brook, Miss Jane Marple sat in her neat parlour, a delicate china teacup balanced on its saucer beside her. The afternoon sun filtered through lace curtains, casting soft patterns on the worn Persian rug. Her hands, nimble despite their years, sorted through a modest stack of letters on the rosewood table. Bills, a note from her nephew Raymond, and the usual parish newsletter. But one envelope stood apart, cream-coloured, heavy, with a wax seal bearing an unfamiliar crest. She adjusted her spectacles, her pale blue eyes sharpening with curiosity, and slit it open with a silver letter knife. The invitation was penned in an elegant hand, requesting her presence for a weekend aboard the Seraphina, a yacht owned by Mr. Lionel Brent, a name that stirred vague memories of financial columns in the Times. The host, however, was her old friend Sir Henry Clithering, retired Scotland Yard Commissioner, whose occasional visits to St. Mary Mead were a delight to Miss Marple's keen mind. A small gathering, the invitation promised, of distinguished company for a cruise along the southern coast. The date was set for the coming Friday, departing from Southampton. Sir Henry had added a postscript in his own bold scrawl. "Do come, Jane. Your knack for seeing through people might liven things up." Miss Marple leaned back in her armchair, her thoughts drifting. She was no stranger to Sir Henry's invitations, which often masked a subtle request for her peculiar talent, observing the quiet currents of human behaviour that others missed. A yacht, she mused, was a curious setting, a floating world cut off from the mainland, where masks might slip under the strain of close quarters. She recalled a conversation at the vicarage months ago about Lionel Brent, a brusque industrialist whose empire of steel and shipping had made him a fortune, but also enemies. His wife, Clara, was said to be a dazzling creature, though the village whispers hinted at her extravagance. The guest list, partially noted in the invitation, included a Miss Diana Finch, an heiress with a reputation for sharp deals, and Captain Hargrove, the Seraphina's master, about whom Miss Marple knew nothing. Yet. She rose, smoothing her tweed skirt, and crossed to the window, where her garden bloomed with late roses. The village beyond was peaceful, its scandals small, a missing silver spoon, a feud over a flower show prize. A yacht party, however, promised something grander, perhaps darker. She thought of her friend Dolly Bantry, who once remarked that Miss Marple's gentle demeanour hid a mind sharper than a serpent's tooth. Smiling faintly, she returned to the table and penned her acceptance, her script as precise as her thoughts. The Seraphina awaited, and with it, she suspected, a puzzle that would demand her particular skill. As she sealed her reply, Miss Marple's gaze fell on her knitting basket, where a half-finished shawl lay in soft wool. She would bring it along, she decided. The click of needles had a way of putting people at ease, coaxing out truths they didn't mean to share. And on a yacht, where secrets might bob just beneath the surface, she would be ready to listen. Chapter 2. The Seraphina set sail. The sun hung low over Southampton, gilding the waters of the Solent with a molten glow, as Miss Jane Marple stepped onto the quay, her sensible black shoes tapping lightly on the weathered boards. She wore a neatly tailored tweed suit, her white hair tucked beneath a modest hat adorned with a single feather, and carried a small valise in one hand, her knitting bag slung over her shoulder. The Seraphina loomed before her, its sleek white hull gleaming like polished ivory, its brass fittings catching the light. The yacht was grander than she had imagined, a floating palace of polished teak and gleaming chrome, its 3 decks rising majestically against the backdrop of a cloudless sky. Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes took in every detail, the crisp uniforms of the crew, the flutter of pennants in the breeze, and the faint hum of anticipation that seemed to ripple through the air. Sir Henry Clithering, his silver hair catching the sunlight, awaited her at the gangplank, his face creasing into a warm smile. "Jane, you've made it," he said, offering his arm with a gallantry that belied his years. "I feared you might change your mind about this jaunt." "Nonsense, Henry," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but firm, a twinkle in her eye. "A weekend on a yacht is hardly an ordeal, and I confess I'm curious about our company." She glanced past him, noting the bustle of guests and crew. "You've a knack for gathering interesting people." Sir Henry chuckled, guiding her aboard. "Interesting or troublesome? We shall see." The deck of the Seraphina was a hive of activity. Stewards in crisp white jackets darted about, balancing trays of champagne flutes, while guests in tailored suits and flowing dresses mingled, their laughter bright but tinged with the artifice Miss Marple so often detected in polite society. She paused, her gaze sweeping the scene, cataloguing faces and postures with the precision of a botanist studying rare blooms. There was Mr. Lionel Brent, the yacht's owner, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with a ruddy complexion and a booming voice that carried over the chatter. He stood near the railing, gesturing expansively as he spoke to a young woman in an emerald green dress, whose laughter rang a shade too loud. That, Miss Marple deduced, must be Clara Brent, his wife, whose penchant for extravagance had reached even Saint Mary Mead's gossip circles. Nearby, a tall woman in a sleek cream suit stood apart, her dark hair swept into an elegant chignon. Her eyes, cool and assessing, scanned the deck with a detachment that intrigued Miss Marple. This, she guessed, was Miss Diana Finch, the heiress whose name had appeared in the invitation. Her reputation as a formidable businesswoman preceded her, and Miss Marple noted the slight tension in her posture, as if she were poised for a duel rather than a pleasure cruise. The crew, too, drew her attention. A young deckhand, no older than 20, fumbled with a tray of canapés, his hands trembling as he offered them to a guest. His name, she overheard, was Tommy Reed, and his nervous glances suggested a man ill at ease in this glittering world. Captain Hargrove, the Seraphina's master, stood at the helm, his weathered face set in a mask of professional calm. His navy blue uniform was immaculate, but his eyes, when they met Miss Marple's, held a flicker of wariness. She made a mental note of it, her fingers brushing the handle of her knitting bag as she followed Sir Henry to the main saloon. The saloon was a marvel of opulence, its walls panelled in dark mahogany, its chandeliers casting a soft glow over velvet-upholstered chairs, and a long table set with crystal and silver. Miss Marple settled into a corner seat, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed the guests. Sir Henry introduced her to Mr. Brent, who greeted her with a hearty handshake that seemed more performative than genuine. "Miss Marple, is it?" "Henry's told me you're a sharp one," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if sizing her up. "Hope you enjoy the Seraphina." "She's my pride and joy. I'm sure I shall," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild, her smile disarming. "It's a splendid vessel." Clara Brent swept over, her emerald dress shimmering, a diamond bracelet glinting at her wrist. "Oh, Miss Marple, you must tell me about Saint." "Mary Mead. It sounds positively quaint," she said, her voice dripping with a charm that felt rehearsed. Miss Marple murmured something polite about village life, noting Clara's restless fingers and the way her eyes darted to her husband, who was now deep in conversation with Miss Finch. Miss Finch herself approached moments later, her handshake cool and brief. "A pleasure, Miss Marple," she said, her voice smooth as silk, but with an edge that suggested she rarely wasted words. "I understand you're a friend of Sir Henry's. Do you often join these sorts of gatherings?" "Rarely," Miss Marple admitted, her needles pausing. "But I find people fascinating, don't you? Especially in such close quarters." Her eyes met Miss Finch's, and for a moment she sensed a spark of recognition, as if the younger woman knew she was being studied. As the yacht's engines rumbled to life, the Seraphina eased away from the dock, gliding smoothly into the channel. The guests gathered on the upper deck, toasting the voyage with champagne as the coastline receded. Miss Marple, declining a glass in favour of tea, stood near the railing, her shawl draped over her shoulders against the evening breeze. She watched the interactions with a quiet intensity, her mind sifting through the fragments of conversation she overheard. Mr. Brent's voice carried again, this time with a sharper edge, as he spoke to Miss Finch near the bow. "You can't expect me to roll over, Diana," he said, his tone low but heated. "That deal was fair, and you know it." Miss Finch's reply was inaudible, but her posture, rigid, her chin lifted, spoke of defiance. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. A business dispute, perhaps, though the intensity suggested something deeper. She recalled a snippet from a financial gazette about Brent's company outmanoeuvring a rival in a recent merger. Could Miss Finch be that rival? The thought lingered as she turned her attention to Clara, who was now laughing with a group of younger guests, her gestures extravagant, her eyes rarely straying to her husband. Tommy Reed passed by, his tray now empty, his face pale. Miss Marple caught his eye and offered a gentle smile. "You must be busy, young man," she said kindly. "It's quite a responsibility, looking after so many." Tommy started, nearly dropping his tray. Yes, ma'am," he stammered, his accent betraying a working-class upbringing. "It's my first time on a yacht like this. Bit overwhelming." "I'm sure you're doing splendidly," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. She noted his bitten nails and the way his eyes flicked toward Mr. Brent. There was a story there, she was certain, though she would not press him now. People, she had learned, revealed themselves in their own time, especially when they thought no one was watching. The evening wore on, and the guests dispersed to their cabins to dress for dinner. Miss Marple, escorted by Sir Henry, descended to her own quarters, a compact but comfortable cabin with a porthole offering a view of the darkening sea. She unpacked her valise, placing her knitting on the small table beside the bed, and paused to reflect. The Seraphina was a microcosm, she thought, a stage where egos and ambitions would play out. Already she sensed undercurrents: Brent's brusqueness, Clara's theatricality, Miss Finch's guarded intensity, and Tommy's nervous unease. Even Captain Hargrove, with his steady demeanour, seemed to carry a shadow of secrecy. Dinner was served in the saloon, the table a vision of white linen and flickering candles. Miss Marple, seated between Sir Henry and a jovial banker named Mr. Grayson, listened more than she spoke, her needles resting in her lap. The conversation was lively, touching on politics, art, and the latest London scandals, but Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the silences, the moments when glances were exchanged or words left unsaid. Mr. Brent dominated the table, his anecdotes laced with self-aggrandizement, while Clara interjected with bright, brittle laughter. Miss Finch, seated opposite, ate sparingly, her eyes fixed on her plate, though Miss Marple caught her stealing a glance at Brent, her expression unreadable. Captain Hargrove joined them briefly, offering a toast to a smooth voyage. His manner was polished, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hand as he raised his glass. Was it fatigue, or something more? She recalled Sir Henry's mention of the captain's past, a dismissal from a merchant ship, the details unclear. It was a thread to tug later, she decided. As the meal concluded, the guests drifted to the upper deck, where a string quartet played under a canopy of stars. Miss Marple, declining to dance, settled into a wicker chair. Her knitting resumed. Sir Henry joined her, his expression thoughtful. "What do you make of our little party, Jane?" he asked, his voice low. She smiled faintly, her needles clicking rhythmically. "People are rarely what they seem, Henry. There's a tension here, don't you think? As if everyone's waiting for something to happen." He raised an eyebrow. "You're uncanny. You know that. I've felt it too. Brent's got enemies, and not just in business." "I'd wager," Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to Miss Finch, who stood alone near the railing, her silhouette stark against the moonlit sea. "Enemies, yes," she murmured, "and perhaps secrets they'd rather keep hidden." The night deepened, the yacht gliding through the calm waters of the Channel. Miss Marple, retiring to her cabin, left her porthole open, letting the salt air drift in. She sat for a moment, her knitting idle, her mind turning over the day's observations. The Seraphina was beautiful, but beneath its polished surface she sensed a current of unease, like the first ripple before a storm. She thought of her garden in St. Mary Mead, where weeds often hid beneath the prettiest blooms. Here, too, she suspected, something was concealed, waiting to be uncovered. As she slipped into bed, the gentle rock of the yacht lulling her, Miss Marple's last thought was of Tommy Reed's trembling hands. A nervous boy, she mused, or a boy with something to hide. Time, she knew, would tell, and she would be watching. Chapter 3. The night of the incident. The Seraphina cut through the Channel's inky waters, its decks aglow with the soft radiance of lanterns strung along the railings. The night was warm, the air heavy with the scent of salt and the faint perfume of Clara Brent's jasmine-scented shawl. Miss Jane Marple, seated on the upper deck in a cushioned wicker chair, her knitting a soft cascade of wool in her lap, observed the scene with her usual quiet attentiveness. The string quartet played a lilting waltz, and the guests, flushed with champagne and the novelty of the voyage, moved in graceful orbits across the polished teak. Yet beneath the merriment, Miss Marple sensed a tautness, like a violin string stretched near to breaking. Mr. Lionel Brent held court near the bar, his voice booming over the music as he recounted a tale of outwitting a rival in a Manchester steel deal. His broad frame, clad in a tailored dinner jacket, seemed to dominate the space, though his eyes, sharp and restless, darted frequently to the edges of the crowd. Clara Brent, resplendent in a gown of sapphire silk, danced with a young stockbroker, her laughter bright but brittle, her diamond earrings catching the light. Miss Diana Finch, by contrast, stood aloof near the starboard railing, her cream silk dress a stark contrast to the dark sea beyond. Her face was composed, but her fingers, clutching a champagne flute, betrayed a faint tremor. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, a counterpoint to the music, as she watched the interplay of glances and gestures. She noted Tommy Reed, the nervous deckhand, weaving through the crowd with a tray of drinks. His eyes downcast but flickering toward Mr. Brent whenever he passed. Captain Hargrove, too, made an appearance, his navy blue uniform crisp as he exchanged pleasantries with the guests. His smile was professional, but Miss Marple caught the way his gaze lingered on Mr. Brent, as if measuring him. The evening's gaiety reached its peak as the quartet struck up a lively foxtrot. Clara Brent, now partnered with Sir Henry Clithering, spun across the deck, her laughter drawing smiles from those nearby. Miss Marple, declining an invitation to dance from the jovial Mr. Grayson remained in her chair, her tea cooling beside her. She was content to observe, her mind sifting through the fragments of conversation she had overheard earlier. At dinner, she had caught a snatch of Mr. Brent's words to Miss Finch, spoken in a low, heated tone. "You'll regret crossing me, Diana." "This isn't over." Miss Finch's reply had been too soft to hear, but her eyes had flashed with something like defiance, or fear. Now, as the music swelled, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a quieter corner of the deck, where Mr. Brent and Miss Finch stood in close conference. Their voices were hushed, but the intensity of their postures, Brent leaning forward, his face flushed, Finch standing rigid, her chin lifted, suggested an argument. Miss Marple strained to catch their words, but the music and laughter drowned them out. She noted, however, that Brent's hand gestured, sharply, pointing toward the sea, while Miss Finch's lips pressed into a thin line. The exchange lasted only a moment before Brent turned abruptly and strode toward the bar, leaving Miss Finch alone, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered this. A business dispute, perhaps, but the venom in Brent's tone hinted at something personal. She recalled the Financial Gazette's mention of a merger that had cost Miss Finch dearly. Had Brent's triumph come at her expense? And if so, how far might she go to settle the score? Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden shift in the crowd's mood. The music faltered, then stopped, as a piercing scream rent the air. It came from the starboard side, near where Miss Finch had stood moments before. The guests froze, their faces a tableau of shock and confusion. Sir Henry, ever quick to act, pushed through the crowd, Miss Marple following at a slower pace, her knitting tucked into her bag. By the time she reached the railing, a knot of people had gathered, their voices a jumble of alarm. Clara Brent, her face pale beneath her rouge, clutched the arm of the stockbroker, gasping, "Where's Lionel? He was just here." Captain Hargrove appeared, his expression grim as he barked orders to the crew. "Man the searchlights! Check the decks!" Tommy Reed, his tray abandoned, stood trembling nearby, his eyes wide with panic. Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the group, noted his reaction, as well as the absence of Miss Finch, who had slipped away in the chaos. Sir Henry, kneeling by the railing, examined the polished surface, his brow furrowed. "No signs of a struggle," he muttered, almost to himself. "But he can't have just vanished." The crew sprang into action, their searchlights sweeping the dark waters below. Miss Marple, her shawl drawn tight against the sudden chill, peered over the railing. The sea was calm, its surface unbroken save for the yacht's wake, but the depth and darkness offered no clues. Mr. Brent was gone, and the word that rippled through the crowd was as stark as it was unthinkable: overboard. Captain Hargrove took charge, his voice steady but strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to the saloon. We'll conduct a thorough search and notify the authorities." His eyes met Miss Marple's for a fleeting moment, and she saw in them a flicker of unease, quickly masked. The guests, murmuring anxiously, complied, their earlier merriment replaced by a heavy silence. Clara Brent, now sobbing theatrically, was escorted below by a steward, her sapphire gown trailing like a fallen banner. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, her gaze sweeping the deck. The starboard railing, where Brent had last been seen, was unremarkable, its red paint gleaming under the lanterns. Yet something about the scene nagged at her, a detail out of place, though she could not yet name it. She noted Tommy Reed still hovering nearby, his hands twisting together as if to wring out his fear. "Poor lad," she murmured, though her mind was already turning over possibilities. An accident, as the captain seemed eager to suggest, or something more deliberate. Sir Henry joined her, his face grave. "This is a bad business, Jane," he said quietly. "Brent was no saint, but to go over like that, it doesn't sit right." "No," Miss Marple agreed, her voice soft but certain. "It doesn't. People don't simply vanish, Henry, not without help." Her eyes, bright and piercing, met his. "We must watch closely now. Someone knows more than they're saying." As the guests retreated to the saloon, Miss Marple followed, her steps measured, her mind alert. The Seraphina, once a stage for laughter and luxury, now felt like a trap, its polished surfaces hiding truths that would not stay buried. She thought of her village, where secrets were often betrayed by a careless word or a fleeting glance. Here, in this floating world, the stakes were higher, but the game, she suspected, was much the same. Settling into a chair, her knitting resumed, she prepared to listen, to watch, and to wait for the truth to surface. Chapter 4. The Captain's Account. The saloon of the Seraphina was a study in strained silence as the guests gathered, their faces etched with unease under the soft glow of the chandeliers. The string quartet had been dismissed, the music replaced by the low hum of the yacht's engines and the occasional creak of wood, as the vessel rocked gently on the channel's waves. Miss Jane Marple sat near a corner, her knitting needles moving with a steady rhythm that belied the sharpness of her gaze. Her shawl, a soft grey wool, draped over her shoulders, and a cup of tea, now lukewarm, rested on the table beside her. The air was thick with questions, but no one dared voice them too loudly, as if speaking might summon further calamity. Captain Hargrove stood at the head of the room, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, his navy blue uniform a stark contrast to the pallor of his face. He cleared his throat, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command, though Miss Marple noted a faint tremor in his tone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I understand this is a distressing moment. Mr. Brent's disappearance is a tragedy, but I must assure you that my crew is doing everything possible. We've searched the waters and the ship, and I've radioed the Coast Guard. For now, I believe this was a tragic accident. Mr. Brent had been drinking, and the railings, as you've seen, are low." A murmur rippled through the guests, some nodding, others exchanging sceptical glances. Clara Brent, seated on a velvet settee, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Her sapphire gown crumpled as if she'd collapsed into the seat. "An accident," she said, her voice breaking. "Lionel was careful, always careful. He wouldn't just fall." Her words dissolved into a sob, though Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the careful way Clara's fingers adjusted her diamond bracelet, as if ensuring it caught the light. Sir Henry Clithering, standing near the captain, raised a hand for silence. "We'll need statements from everyone," he said, his tone clipped, the old Scotland Yard instinct resurfacing. "If anyone saw Mr. Brent in the moments before he went overboard, it's vital you come forward." His gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on Miss Diana Finch, who sat poised in a high-backed chair, her cream silk dress immaculate, her expression unreadable. She met his look with a cool nod, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Miss Marple's needles paused as she studied Captain Hargrove. His explanation was plausible, too plausible perhaps, like a story rehearsed. She recalled his fleeting glance on the deck, the wariness in his eyes when Mr. Brent's name was mentioned. Now, as he answered Sir Henry's questions about the yacht's position at the time of the incident, his responses were measured but vague. "We were on a standard southerly course, sir," he said, producing a logbook from his pocket. "Nothing unusual. The sea was calm, visibility clear. May I see that log?" Sir Henry asked, his tone polite but firm. Hargrove hesitated, a fraction of a second too long, before handing it over. Miss Marple, though too far to read the entries, noted the captain's tightened jaw as Sir Henry flipped through the pages. "These times seem approximate," Sir Henry remarked, his brow furrowing. "You logged the course change at 9:15, but no precise coordinates." Hargrove's smile was tight. "A clerical oversight, sir. We were focused on the guest's safety." He glanced at the assembled company, as if seeking support, but found only curious stares. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind turning over his words. An oversight? Or a deliberate omission? She thought of the village postmistress, Mrs. Cleet, whose oversights in delivering letters often masked her curiosity about their contents. People, she knew, hid truths in the gaps of their stories. The guests were dismissed to their cabins, but Miss Marple lingered, her tea untouched, as Sir Henry conferred with Hargrove in a low voice. She caught fragments of their conversation, Something about the captain's past. A dismissal from a merchant ship years ago, the details obscured by rumour. Sir Henry had mentioned it to her in passing, and now it loomed larger in her mind. A man with a shadowed history might have reasons to be evasive, though whether those reasons connected to Mr. Brent's fate remained unclear. As the saloon emptied, Miss Marple rose, her movements slow but deliberate, and approached Tommy Reed, who was clearing away glasses with a clatter that betrayed his nerves. "You've had a shock, haven't you, young man?" she said gently, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. Tommy started, nearly dropping a flute, his boyish face pale under the saloon's lights. "Yes, ma'am," he mumbled, his eyes darting to the door where Hargrove had exited. "It's awful. What happened to Mr.?" Brent never seen anything like it. Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. It must be difficult working on such a grand ship. So many important people, so much to keep track of. She paused, her eyes kind but searching. "You were on deck when it happened, weren't you? Did you see Mr. Brent?" Tommy's hands froze, his knuckles white around the tray. I was serving drinks, ma'am. Didn't see much. Just heard the scream." His voice cracked, and he looked away, his gaze fixed on the polished floor. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone unchanged. "But you're observant, I can tell. A young man like you notices things, even when you're busy." She smiled, and Tommy's shoulders relaxed slightly, though his eyes remained wary. She did not press further. Pushing too hard, she knew, could close a door as easily as open it. Instead, she wished him good night and made her way to the deck, where the air was cooler, the stars sharp against the velvet sky. The Seraphina felt different now, its elegance tainted by the shadow of tragedy. Miss Marple stood by the starboard railing, her shawl drawn tight, and looked down at the dark water below. The red paint on the railing gleamed, unmarred, but she wondered what it might conceal. A scuff, a scratch, a trace of a struggle. She thought of her garden in St. Mary Mead, where a single broken stem could betray a careless foot. Here, too, she sensed a disturbance, though the evidence was yet to be found. Sir Henry joined her, his face drawn. "Hargrove's story holds for now," he said quietly, "but I don't like it. Too neat, and that logbook's a mess. What do you think, Jane?" She tilted her head, her eyes distant. "People are quick to call things accidents, Henry, when they want to avoid questions. The captain's hiding something, though whether it's guilt or merely embarrassment I can't say. And young Tommy, he's frightened, but not just of this tragedy. There's a thread here, connecting them all, but it's tangled." Sir Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You see things I miss, Jane. Always have. I'll keep an eye on Hargrove, but we need more. If this wasn't an accident, it wasn't," Miss Marple said softly, her voice carrying a quiet certainty. "Mr. O'Brent was a man with enemies, and enemies don't wait for accidents. We must listen, Henry, and watch. The truth will show itself, in time." She turned back to the railing, her gaze lingering on the sea. The Seraphina sailed on, its course steady, but Miss Marple felt the weight of unseen currents beneath the surface. Someone on this yacht knew what had happened to Lionel Brent, and she would find them, not with haste, but with the patient precision of her knitting, stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 5. The Crew's Whispers. The morning after Mr. Brent's disappearance dawned clear, with the Seraphina anchored off the Isle of Wight, its white hull a stark contrast to the grey-green sea. The guests, subdued and restless, gathered for breakfast in the saloon, their conversation muted, punctuated by the clink of silver on porcelain. Miss Jane Marple, seated at a small table near a porthole, sipped her tea and nibbled at a scone, her knitting bag at her side. Her eyes, bright and unobtrusive behind her spectacles, moved from face to face, noting the strain in Clara Brent's forced smiles, the cool detachment of Miss Diana Finch, and the absence of Captain Hargrove, who had yet to appear. The air was heavy with unspoken questions, and Miss Marple, ever patient, let the silence work its magic, knowing that tension often loosened tongues. She had risen early, before the sun, to walk the deck alone. The starboard railing, where Mr. Brent had last been seen, offered no obvious clues, no scuffs, no scratches, just the glossy red paint reflecting the dawn. Yet Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of village intrigues, told her that the absence of evidence was itself a kind of evidence. Someone had been careful, perhaps too careful. She thought of Mrs. Pike in St. Mary Mead, who once polished her silver teapot to hide a dent caused by a quarrel. The Seraphina's polished surfaces, she suspected, hid similar secrets. After breakfast, Miss Marple slipped away from the saloon, her steps soft but purposeful, and made her way to the lower deck, where the crew's quarters and service areas were tucked out of sight. She had a knack for finding the unnoticed corners of any world, and here, among the crew, she sensed she might uncover the threads of truth that the guests were too guarded to reveal. The corridor was narrow, smelling of salt and polished wood, and she paused outside the galley, where the clatter of pots and low voices drifted through the half-open door. Inside, she found Tommy Reed, the young deckhand, polishing glasses with a rag, his movements jerky, his face pale as the linen he held. Beside him, a burly man with grease-stained hands, Bill, the engineer she recalled, leaned against a counter muttering something about the engines. Miss Marple knocked lightly, her smile gentle as she stepped inside. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said, her voice as soothing as a summer breeze. "I hope I'm not intruding." "I find a cup of tea in the morning so reviving, don't you?" Tommy started, nearly dropping a glass, his eyes wide with the same nervous flicker she'd noted the night before. Bill, less startled, gave a gruff nod. "Morning, ma'am," he said, wiping his hands on his overalls. "Tea's on the stove if you want it." "How kind," Miss Marple said, moving to the small kettle with a deliberateness that gave her time to observe. She poured herself a cup, her movements slow, and settled onto a stool, her knitting bag at her feet. "It's a dreadful business about Mr. Brent," she said, her tone conversational but her eyes keen. "You must all be terribly shaken, working so hard to keep things running smoothly." Bill shrugged, his face impassive. "Accidents happen, ma'am." "Sea's no place for carelessness." But his eyes slid away, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened on the counter's edge. Tommy, less guarded, swallowed hard. "It's awful, ma'am." "Never thought I'd see something like that." Mr. Brent, he was important, wasn't he? His voice wavered, and he busied himself with the glasses, avoiding her gaze. "Indeed he was," Miss Marple said, her needles emerging from her bag, clicking softly as she began a new row. "And you, Tommy, you were on deck last night, weren't you?" "Serving drinks, I believe." It must be hard to keep track of everyone in such a crowd. Tommy's hands froze, the rag twisting in his fingers. I was busy, ma'am. Didn't see much, just heard the scream like everyone else. His eyes darted to Bill, who gave a slight shake of his head, a gesture so quick Miss Marple nearly missed it. She smiled, her expression unchanged, and, "Of course, dear. But you've a sharp eye, I can tell. Did you happen to notice Mr. Brent talking to anyone before it happened?" Her tone was gentle, almost absent-minded, but her question hung in the air like a hook. Tommy hesitated, his lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. Bill cleared his throat, his voice gruff. "Kids got enough to do without playing detective, ma'am. We all saw Mr. Brent drinking, staggering a bit. Likely he just lost his balance." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking steadily. "Quite likely," she said, though her mind filed away Bill's quick intervention. She sipped her tea, letting the silence stretch, and was rewarded when Tommy, unable to bear it, spoke again. "I did see him, ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Brent, I mean. He was arguing with that lady, Miss Finch, near the railing. Looked angry, both of them. But I didn't hear what they said. I swear his eyes were wide, pleading, as if he feared he'd said too much." Miss Marple's smile was reassuring. "Thank you, Tommy. It's helpful to know what you saw. And you, Mr. Bill, were you on deck at all?" Bill shifted, his bulk filling the small space. "I was below checking the engines. Heard a cry. Thought it was a gull at first. By the time I got up top, everyone was shouting about Mr. Brent." His tone was flat, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes avoided hers, focusing instead on a spot above her head. "I see," she said, her voice as mild as milk. "Well, you've both been most helpful. It's a comfort to know the crew is so diligent." She rose, gathering her knitting, and made her way to the door, pausing to add, "Tommy, if you remember anything else, you'll tell Sir Henry, won't you? Or me, if you prefer. Sometimes the smallest detail matters." Tommy nodded, his face a mixture of relief and fear, while Bill grunted something non-committal. Miss Marple stepped into the corridor, her mind turning over the encounter. Tommy's admission about Miss Finch and Mr. Brent was a thread, thin but strong, connecting to the heated exchange she'd witnessed. Bill's defensiveness, too, was telling. Less like guilt, she thought, and more like a man protecting his own corner. She recalled Mr. Wicks, the St. Mary Mead grocer, whose gruff denials about shortchanging customers always hid a deeper unease. The crew, she suspected, knew more than they were saying, and Tommy was the key. She made her way to the upper deck, where the guests were beginning to stir, some pacing restlessly, others staring out at the sea. Sir Henry stood near the helm, deep in conversation with Captain Hargrove, who looked more haggard than the previous night, his eyes shadowed. Miss Marple approached, her steps light, and caught the tail end of their discussion. Something about the yacht's radio, and a delayed response from the Coast Guard. Sir Henry turned, his face lighting up at her approach. "Jane, you're up early. Any thoughts on our little mystery?" She smiled, settling onto a nearby bench, her knitting resuming its rhythm. "Only that people are rarely as forthcoming as one hopes, Henry. I've just had a chat with young Tommy Reed and the engineer Bill. They're uneasy, and not just about Mr. Brent's fall." Sir Henry raised an eyebrow, lowering his voice. "What did they say?" "Tommy saw Mr. Brent arguing with Miss Finch just before the incident," she said, her eyes on her needles. "He's frightened, poor boy, and I think he knows more than he's telling." Bill was quick to dismiss it all as an accident, but he's hiding something too. Not guilt, I think, but something. Sir Henry nodded, his expression grim. I've been pressing Hargrove. His logbooks are shambles, and he's cagey about why. Said he was at the helm all evening, but one of the stewards claims he saw him near the stern around the time of the scream. I don't like it, Jane. Nor do I, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. The captain's secrecy is a puzzle in itself. And Miss Finch, her name keeps surfacing, doesn't it? I wonder what she and Mr. Brent were really arguing about. They were interrupted by the arrival of Clara Brent, her face pale beneath a layer of carefully applied powder, her eyes red-rimmed. Sir Henry, Miss Marple, she said, her voice trembling. Have you heard anything? The Coast Guard. Have they found Lionel? Sir Henry shook his head, his tone gentle. Not yet, Mrs. Brent, we're doing all we can. If you remember anything from last night, anything at all, it could help. Clara's fingers twisted her handkerchief, her diamond bracelet glinting. I was dancing, laughing. I didn't see him after dinner. He was with that Finch woman earlier, but I thought it was just business. Her voice broke, and she turned away, her shoulders shaking. Miss Marple watched her go, her lips pursing slightly. Clara's grief seemed genuine, yet there was a theatricality to it, like Miss Elspeth's dramatics at the Saint, Mary Mead amateur theatricals. Was it sorrow, or a performance to deflect suspicion? She filed the thought away, her needles clicking as she turned her gaze to the sea, where the horizon offered no answers, only questions. Chapter 6. The Rival's Motive. The Seraphina lay anchored under a sky of unbroken blue, its stillness a stark contrast to the undercurrents of suspicion rippling among the guests. The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck, where Miss Jane Marple sat in a cushioned chair, her knitting a soft cascade of wool in her lap. Her eyes, bright and unobtrusive behind her spectacles, followed the movements of the passengers as they emerged from their cabins, their faces drawn with the strain of a sleepless night. The disappearance of Mr. Lionel Brent had cast a pall over the yacht, transforming its opulent decks into a stage for whispered doubts and guarded glances. Miss Marple, with her quiet air of inconsequence, was ideally placed to observe, her needles clicking like the steady tick of a clock, measuring the moments until secrets surfaced. Breakfast had been a subdued affair, with Clara Brent absent, reportedly indisposed, and Captain Hargrove making only a brief appearance, his weathered face set in a mask of professional calm. Miss Diana Finch, however, was present, her cream linen suit as immaculate as ever, her dark hair swept into a severe chignon. She sat alone at a small table, her coffee untouched, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Miss Marple noted the tightness of her jaw, the way her fingers drummed lightly on the tablecloth. A rhythm of unease, she thought, like young Mr. Carter in St. Mary Mead, whose nervous tics had betrayed his part in a petty theft. Sir Henry Clithering joined Miss Marple on the deck, his expression grim as he settled beside her, a notebook in hand. I've been digging into Brent's affairs, he said, his voice low, mindful of the crew bustling nearby. Seems he and Miss Finch had a history, a nasty one. Brent's company outmaneuvered hers in a merger last year, a steelworks deal that left her company teetering, cost her millions, and her reputation took a hit. The financial papers called it a bloodbath. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. A bloodbath, you say? That's a strong word, Henry. People don't forget such losses, nor forgive them easily. I saw them arguing last night, you know, Mr. Brent and Miss Finch, near the starboard railing. It was no idle disagreement. There was venom in it. Sir Henry nodded, flipping open his notebook. I've got a contact in London who confirmed it. Finch was furious, threatened to sue Brent, but her case fell apart. She's not one to let things go, from what I hear. Ruthless, they say, though you'd never guess it from her polish. Miss Marple glanced at Miss Finch, who had risen and was now pacing the deck, her movements precise but restless. Polish can hide a great deal, Henry, she said softly, like the wax on Mrs. Harrow's dining table, covering scratches from years of use. Miss Finch strikes me as a woman who plans her moves carefully, but anger can make even the cautious reckless. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a steward, who delivered a fresh pot of tea with a deferential nod. Miss Marple thanked him, her smile disarming, and poured a cup, her movements deliberate as her mind turned over the new information. A financial feud was a potent motive, she knew. Money, like love, could drive people to desperate acts. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where Mr. Finchley, the butcher, had nearly come to blows over a disputed debt. Miss Finch, with her wealth and ambition, was playing on a larger stage, but the passions were the same. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple decided to seek out Miss Finch herself. She found her in the saloon, seated near a window, a book open in her lap, though her eyes were fixed on the sea beyond. Miss Marple approached, her knitting bag slung over her arm, her expression one of gentle concern. "Miss Finch, may I join you?" she asked, her voice as soft as a breeze. "I find the sea so calming, don't you, despite all that's happened?" Miss Finch looked up, her green eyes cool but not unkind. "Of course, Miss Marple," she said, gesturing to the chair opposite, "though I confess I'm finding little calm today." Her tone was measured, but there was a brittleness to it, like porcelain on the verge of cracking. Miss Marple settled into the chair, her needles emerging with a soft clink. "Such a dreadful shock, Mr. Brent's accident," she said, her tone sympathetic. "You knew him, I understand." "Business acquaintances, perhaps." Miss Finch's lips tightened, a fleeting shadow crossing her face. "Barely," she said, her voice smooth but clipped. "We crossed paths in a deal or two, but nothing significant. He was a forceful man, not one to make friends easily." She closed her book, her fingers lingering on the cover, as if to steady herself. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking rhythmically. "So I've heard. Business can be such a thorny thing, can't it? I remember a gentleman in my village, a grocer, who lost his shop over a bad deal. It changed him, made him bitter. I suppose it's the same in your world. With so much at stake." Miss Finch's eyes met hers, a flicker of wariness in their depths. "It can be," she said, her voice careful, "but one learns to move on. Dwelling on losses is a weakness." She rose, smoothing her skirt. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I have some correspondence to attend to." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering. As Miss Finch departed, her heels clicking on the polished floor, Miss Marple's mind catalogued the encounter. The younger woman's composure was admirable, but her deflection was too swift, too practised. Like Miss Elspeth in St. Mary Mead, who had denied an affair with a married man until the letters were found, Miss Finch was guarding something, perhaps a grudge that had turned deadly. Later, Miss Marple joined Sir Henry for a walk along the deck, where the sea breeze carried a hint of salt and tension. He shared another piece of information, a telegram from his London contact, hinting at rumours that Miss Finch had been seen meeting with Brent's competitors just before the merger collapsed. She played a dangerous game, Sir Henry said, his voice low. If Brent humiliated her publicly, it might have pushed her too far. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the horizon. Humiliation is a powerful force, Henry. It festers, like a wound untended. And Miss Finch, for all her elegance, has the look of someone who doesn't forgive easily. She paused, her thoughts drifting to Clara Brent, whose absence at breakfast had been conspicuous. What of Mrs. Brent? Her grief seems theatrical, don't you think? I wonder if she knew of her husband's enemies, or perhaps shared them. Sir Henry frowned, his hand tightening on the railing. She's been in her cabin all morning, according to the steward. I'll speak to her later, but she's fragile. Too fragile, perhaps. I don't trust it, nor do I, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but certain. Grief can be a mask, Henry, as easily as a smile. We must watch her, and Miss Finch, and young Tommy Reed. They're all pieces in this puzzle, and I suspect the picture is far from complete. As they parted, Miss Marple returned to her chair. Her knitting resumed, her mind sifting through the threads she had gathered. Miss Finch's motive was clear, a financial wound that cut deep, but motive alone was not proof. The Seraphina was a web of secrets, and Miss Marple, with her patient, unassuming air, was determined to untangle it, stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 7. A Clue in the Cabin. The Seraphina remained anchored, its engine silent, as the midday sun bathed the deck in a golden haze. The guests restless under the weight of Mr. Lionel Brent's disappearance drifted between the saloon and their cabins, their conversations hushed and brittle. Miss Jane Marple, however, found solace in the quiet of her own thoughts, seated in a shaded corner of the upper deck, with her knitting in her lap. Her needles moved with a steady rhythm, a soft counterpoint to the lap of waves against the hull. But her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, missed nothing. The yacht, she sensed, was a stage where every gesture and glance held meaning, and she was determined to read the script beneath the surface. Sir Henry Clithering, ever the pragmatist, had spent the morning coordinating with the Coast Guard via radio, his face etched with frustration at their lack of progress. No trace of Mr. Brent had been found in the waters, and the absence of a body only deepened the mystery. Over a late breakfast, he confided in Miss Marple his growing suspicion that the truth lay closer to hand. Among the passengers and crew. "We need evidence, Jane," he said, his voice low as they sat in the saloon. "Something tangible. Hargrove's logbook is a mess, and the crew's tight-lipped. I'm thinking of searching Brent's cabin. Care to join me?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained demure. "A search, Henry? How very official. I suppose a harmless old lady might tag along, if only to keep you company." Her tone was light, but her mind was already racing, eager to uncover what secrets Mr. Brent might have left behind. She thought of Mrs. Tuttle in St. Mary Mead, whose locked desk had revealed a trove of letters that solved a village scandal. A man like Brent, she suspected, would not travel without his own secrets. With the guests occupied and Captain Hargrove distracted by a maintenance issue in the engine room, Sir Henry secured permission from the ship's steward to inspect Mr. Brent's cabin. Miss Marple followed, her knitting bag slung over her arm, her steps soft but purposeful. The cabin was on the upper deck, a spacious suite with polished mahogany walls, a wide porthole offering a view of the glittering sea, and a desk cluttered with papers. The bed was neatly made, a testament to the crew's efficiency, but the air held a faint staleness, as if the room knew its occupant would not return. Sir Henry began with the desk, sifting through documents with a practised eye. Contracts mostly, he muttered, flipping through pages. Shipping agreements, financial reports. Brent was a busy man. He paused, pulling out a leather-bound notebook. This looks personal. Names, dates, figures. Could be useful. Miss Marple, meanwhile, moved to the wardrobe, her fingers brushing the fine wool of Brent's suits. She was not searching for the obvious. She knew that truth often hid in the overlooked corners. On the floor, beneath a pair of polished shoes, she spotted a folded piece of paper, its edges frayed. She knelt, her movements slow to avoid creaking joints, and retrieved it. It was a letter, written in a precise, feminine hand, and signed with a flourish, Diana Finch. The words were sharp, almost venomous. You will not get away with this, Lionel. I've consulted my solicitors, and they assure me we have a case. Your underhanded tactics will cost you more than you imagine. The date was recent, just weeks before the voyage. Henry, Miss Marple said softly, holding out the letter. I believe this is worth a look. Sir Henry read it quickly, his sewn brow furrowing. This ties Finch to Brent's feud directly, threatening legal action no less. It's not proof of murder, but it's a motive carved in ink. He tucked the letter into his notebook, his expression grim. She didn't mention this when we spoke. Said their dealings were insignificant. Miss Marple nodded, her lips pursing. People often downplay what burns them most, Henry. Miss Finch strikes me as a woman who guards her wounds carefully. She thought of Miss Elspeth in St. Mary Mead, whose calm denials had crumbled when confronted with her own letters. The letter was a thread, but Miss Marple sensed there was more to find. She moved to the bedside table, where a silver cigarette case gleamed under the porthole's light. Beside it lay a torn photograph, its edges jagged as if ripped in haste. She picked it up, her fingers careful, and studied the image Mr. Brent, younger and smiling, his arm around a young woman with a familiar face. Miss Marple's memory clicked into place. She had seen a resemblance in Tommy Reed's boyish features. Could this be his sister? The photograph was incomplete, the other half missing, but the intimacy of the pose suggested a connection deeper than employer and employee. Henry, look at this, she said, passing him the photograph. Doesn't the young woman remind you of our nervous deckhand, Tommy? I wonder if Mr. Brent had a history with his family. Sir Henry squinted at the image, his expression thoughtful. Could be. Tommy's been jumpy since we boarded, and he admitted seeing Brent with Finch. If there's a personal tie here, it might explain his fear. He slipped the photograph into his notebook alongside the letter. I'll ask him about it, discreetly. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the floor, where a small smudge caught her eye. A faint streak of red, barely noticeable against the dark wood. She knelt again, her handkerchief pressed to the spot and rubbed gently. The smudge came away, leaving a faint residue on the cloth. "Red paint?" she murmured, holding it up to the light. "The same shade as the starboard railing, don't you think?" Sir Henry's eyes narrowed. "That's no coincidence. If someone repainted the railing after Brent went over, they might have come here to clean up." "But why the cabin?" "To hide something," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but certain. "A struggle, perhaps, or a trace of their presence. In my village, mister, Wicks once painted over a scratched counter to hide a theft. It's the same instinct, to erase the evidence of guilt." She rose, folding the handkerchief carefully into her bag. "We must be cautious, Henry. Whoever did this is clever, and they're watching." They left the cabin, locking the door behind them, and returned to the deck, where the guests were gathering for lunch. Miss Marple's mind was a whirl of connections. The letter from Miss Finch, the photograph linked to Tommy, the red paint tying the cabin to the railing. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture remained elusive. She thought of her garden in St. Mary Mead, where a single weed could betray a hidden root. Here, too, she sensed a root of malice, carefully concealed but waiting to be unearthed. As they joined the others, Miss Marple's eyes sought out Miss Finch, who stood near the buffet, her posture as poised as ever. Clara Brent, emerging from her cabin at last, hovered nearby, her eyes red but her dress freshly pressed, a new necklace glinting at her throat. Tommy Reed moved among the guests, his tray steady but his face pale, while Captain Hargrove watched from the helm, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting resumed, and let her thoughts settle like dust after a storm. The Seraphina was a web of motives and secrets, and she was determined to trace every thread to its source. Chapter 8. The Widow's Secret. The Seraphina rocked gently on the sunlit waves, its decks quiet save for the murmur of the guests and the distant cry of a gull. The afternoon sun cast a golden sheen over the yacht, but the warmth did little to dispel the chill of suspicion that had settled over its passengers. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner of the upper deck, her knitting a soft tangle of wool in her lap, observed the scene with her characteristic blend of serenity and scrutiny. Her needles moved with a steady rhythm, a soothing counterpoint to the tension that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The disappearance of Mr. Lionel Brent had transformed the Seraphina into a floating enigma, and Miss Marple, with her quiet air of inconsequence, was piecing together its secrets stitch by stitch. Lunch had been a strained affair, with the guests picking at their plates, their eyes darting to Clara Brent, who had emerged from her cabin with a carefully composed expression. Her black dress, elegant yet sombre, was offset by a new necklace, a string of pearls that gleamed with understated opulence. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, noted the necklace's extravagance, an odd choice for a widow so recently bereaved. Clara's grief, though voiced in soft sobs and trembling hands, had a staged quality, like Miss Elspeth's performances in the St. Mary Mead theatricals, where tears came too readily to be wholly trusted. Sir Henry Clithering, ever the diligent investigator, had spent the morning questioning the crew, his notebook filling with terse observations. He joined Miss Marple on the deck, his face etched with frustration. "The Coast Guards found nothing," he said, his voice low as he settled beside her. "No body, no debris." It's as if Brent vanished into thin air. But I've got something else. Something odd. The steward, Jenkins, saw Clara Brent slipping into Captain Hargrove's cabin last night, before the incident. Stayed there for a good 10 minutes. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. Indeed, that's curious, Henry. A grieving wife seeking comfort, perhaps, but so soon after her husband's disappearance. And with the captain, who's been so evasive himself. She thought of Mrs. Tuttle in St. Mary Mead, whose late-night visits to the vicar's study had sparked gossip that proved more than idle. What did Jenkins say exactly? He was cagey, Sir Henry replied, flipping open his notebook. Said he was passing by Hargrove's cabin around 9. Saw Clara go in, looking furtive, his word. She came out quickly, adjusting her shawl, and he didn't think much of it until this morning. Didn't want to speak out of turn, but I pressed him. Hargrove denies it. Says he was at the helm all evening. Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind turning over this new thread. Denials are telling, Henry, especially when they come so quickly. The captain's logbook was vague, his manner guarded. And now Clara, with her new pearls and her secret visits. It's a pattern, don't you think? Like the patchwork quilt Mrs. Pike made, all bright squares hiding frayed edges underneath. Sir Henry nodded, his expression grim. I'll confront Clara, but gently. She's brittle, and I don't want her clamming up. Any thoughts, Jane? Only that we must tread carefully, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. Clara's grief may be real, but it's also a shield, and those pearls, they're not the sort one wears on a whim. We must find out where they came from, and why now. She resumed her knitting, her eyes drifting to Clara, who was now strolling the deck with Mr. Grayson, the jovial banker, her laughter a touch too bright. Miss Marple decided to approach Clara herself, sensing that a woman's touch might coax out truths Sir Henry's authority could not. She found her opportunity later that afternoon, when Clara sat alone in the saloon, a glass of sherry untouched before her. Miss Marple approached, her knitting bag in hand, her smile as warm as a summer afternoon. Mrs. Brent, may I join you? She asked, her voice gentle. I thought you might like a little company after such a trying time. Clara looked up, her eyes red but dry, her fingers twisting the pearls at her throat. Oh, Miss Marple, you're kind, she said, her voice tremulous. It's been so awful. Lionel, I can't believe he's gone. Her lips quivered, but Miss Marple noted the careful way she arranged her expression, like an actress preparing for a scene. It's a terrible shock, Miss Marple said, settling into a chair, her needles emerging with a soft clink. I lost a dear friend once, quite suddenly. It's the little things that linger, isn't it? A favourite song, a piece of jewellery. Her eyes flicked to the pearls, her tone light but probing. That's a lovely necklace, my dear. A gift, perhaps. Clara's hand froze on the pearls, her smile faltering. Oh, this? Yes, Lionel gave it to me, recently. He was always so generous. Her voice caught, and she looked away, her fingers tightening on the glass. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking steadily. How thoughtful of him. It must be a comfort, wearing something he chose for you. She paused, her eyes kind but searching. You must have been very close, though I couldn't help noticing you were dancing so gaily last night. Before it happened. Clara's face flushed, a flicker of defensiveness in her eyes. "I was trying to enjoy myself, Miss Marple." "Lionel wanted me to. He was always so busy with business, you see. Meetings, arguments, like with Miss Finch. I didn't think anything of it at the time." Her voice trailed off, and she sipped her sherry, her hand trembling slightly. "Miss Finch, yes," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational. "They seemed to have quite a disagreement, didn't they? Business can be so contentious. Did you know much about their dealings?" Clara shook her head, her pearls glinting as she moved. "Not really. Lionel never shared the details. He said it was all numbers and nonsense, nothing for me to worry about. But I knew she was angry with him. Everyone could see it." Her voice held a hint of spite, quickly masked by a sigh. "I just want to know what happened to him, Miss Marple. It's all so unreal." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said, her smile sympathetic. "We all want answers. And I'm sure they'll come in time." She rose, gathering her knitting, and left Clara to her sherry, her mind cataloguing the encounter. Clara's evasiveness about the pearls, her quick deflection to Miss Finch, it was all too polished, like a story rehearsed. And the visit to Hargrove's cabin, if true, suggested a connection that went beyond grief. She found Sir Henry near the helm, where he was reviewing the crew's statements. "Anything from Clara?" he asked, his eyes hopeful. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "She's hiding something, Henry. Those pearls are new, and her story about them doesn't ring true. And her mention of Miss Finch felt pointed, as if she wanted to direct attention elsewhere. I think she knows more about her husband's enemies than she's letting on." Sir Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'll have Jenkins keep an eye on her. And Hargrove, I'm not done with him. If Clara was in his cabin, there's a reason, and it's not likely innocent." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the sea, where the horizon shimmered in the afternoon light. "People wear masks, Henry, even in grief. Clara's is slipping, but not enough to see the truth yet. We must keep watching. Her, Miss Finch, the captain. The pieces are there, waiting to be fitted together." As she returned to her chair, her knitting resumed. Miss Marple felt the weight of the Seraphina's secrets. The yacht was a puzzle, its polished surfaces hiding jagged edges, and she was determined to uncover them, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 9. The Deckhand's Tale. The Seraphina lay still under a late afternoon sky, the sun dipping low and casting long shadows across the deck, where the air was thick with the scent of salt and the weight of unspoken truths. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her customary wicker chair, her knitting a soft cascade of wool in her lap, watched the guests with her quiet, piercing gaze. The mood aboard the yacht had grown heavier. The initial shock of Mr. Lionel Brent's disappearance hardening into suspicion that clung to every conversation like damp mist. Her needles clicked steadily, a rhythm that grounded her thoughts as she sifted through the fragments of evidence gathered thus far. The letter from Miss Finch, the torn photograph, the red paint smudge, and Clara Brent's evasive tears. Each was a thread, but the pattern remained elusive, like a half-finished quilt in her St. Mary Mead sewing circle. Miss Marple's morning had been spent observing, her presence as unremarkable as a sparrow, yet her mind as sharp as ever. She had noted Miss Diana Finch's continued composure, her cool detachment a stark contrast to Clara Brent's theatrical grief. Captain Hargrove too had been scarce, his brief appearances marked by a strained politeness that did little to mask his unease. But it was young Tommy Reed, the nervous deckhand, who lingered in her thoughts. His trembling hands and fleeting glances suggested a burden beyond the shock of Brent's fate, and Miss Marple, with her knack for coaxing truths from the reluctant, resolved to speak with him again. She found her opportunity as the guests dispersed after tea, some retreating to their cabins, others pacing the deck in restless silence. Tommy was alone near the stern, coiling a rope with a focus that seemed more about avoiding eyes than completing the task. Miss Marple approached, her steps soft on the polished teak, her knitting bag slung over her arm. "Good afternoon, Tommy," she said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "You've been working so hard, haven't you?" "It's a wonder you find time to rest," Tommy started, the rope slipping from his hands. "Oh, Miss Marple," he stammered, his boyish face flushing. "Didn't see you there." Just keeping busy, ma'am." His eyes darted to the deck, avoiding hers, and she noted the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, despite the cool air. "It's a fine thing to stay busy," Miss Marple said, settling onto a nearby bench, her needles emerging with a soft clink. "In my village, when things go wrong, people often find comfort in their work. But it's hard, isn't it, when something so dreadful happens? Poor Mr. Brent, I can't help thinking you might have seen something that night, Tommy, with your sharp eyes." Tommy's hands froze, the rope forgotten. "I told you, ma'am, I was serving drinks," he said, his voice tight. "Heard the scream same as everyone. Didn't see nothing much." His words faltered, and he looked away, his fingers twisting the hem of his jacket. Miss Marple's smile was kind, but her gaze was unrelenting, like a gardener spotting a weed. "Of course, dear," she said, her needles clicking, "but you're a bright lad, and I've seen how you notice things. You mentioned Mr. Brent arguing with Miss Finch, didn't you? Near the railing, just before the scream. It must have been quite a sight. Two such important people at odds." Tommy swallowed hard, his eyes flickering to the sea. "It wasn't my place to listen, ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They were angry, that's all." Mr. Brent was loud, waving his arms. "Miss Finch, she was cold-like, but sharp. I didn't hear the words, I swear." His hands clenched, and Miss Marple saw the fear in his eyes, not just of the moment, but of something deeper. She leaned forward slightly, her tone as soothing as a lullaby. "I believe you, Tommy. But sometimes even the smallest detail matters. Did you see anything else? Miss Finch, perhaps, after their argument? Or anyone near the railing?" She paused, letting the silence work its magic, as she had with young Jimmy in St. Mary Mead, who had confessed to stealing apples after a similar pause. Tommy's resolve crumbled, his shoulders sagging. I saw her, ma'am. Miss Finch, I mean." After they argued, she stayed by the railing, adjusting her shawl. Looked like she was hiding something, but I couldn't tell what. Then the scream came, and I ran over with the others. She was gone by then. His voice cracked, and he looked at her, his eyes pleading. "I didn't want to say, Mum, I need this job. If I get mixed up in this—" Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. "You've done the right thing, Tommy. No one will fault you for telling the truth, and your job is safe, I'm sure. Sir Henry will see to that." She paused, her eyes softening. "You've been carrying a weight, haven't you?" I wonder if it's more than just what you saw. Did you know Mr. Brent before this voyage?" Tommy's face paled, his lips parting as if to deny it, then closing again. "My sister. She worked for him a while back," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "Clerical job, at his office in London. She got sacked, sudden-like. Never said why, but she was upset. Cried for weeks. I took this job to keep an eye on him, I suppose. But I didn't do nothing, ma'am, I swear." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind fitting this new piece into the puzzle. The torn photograph from Brent's cabin, showing him with a young woman who resembled Tommy. It was no coincidence. "I believe you, Tommy," she said, her voice firm. "You've been very brave telling me this. If you remember anything else, you'll come to me, won't you? Or Sir Henry. It's important for Mr. Brent's sake, Tommy." Nodded, his eyes brimming with relief and fear. "Yes, ma'am." "I will." He turned back to the rope, his hands steadier now, as if unburdening himself had lightened his load. Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked away, and made her way to the upper deck, where Sir Henry was conferring with a steward. She shared Tommy's revelations, her voice low to avoid eavesdroppers. "Miss Finch was at the railing, Henry, adjusting her shawl as if to conceal something. And Tommy's sister. There's a connection to Brent, a personal one. That photograph we found. I'm certain it's her." Sir Henry's eyes narrowed, his notebook open in his hand. "That's damning for Finch. If she was there right after the argument, and Tommy saw her hiding something." He paused, his expression grim. "And the sister angle. Brent might have wronged Tommy's family. Gives the boy a motive, though he doesn't strike me as the type, no," Miss Marple agreed, her lips pursing. "Tommy's frightened, not guilty. But Miss Finch, her shawl's missing today, have you noticed? She wore it last night, cream silk with a subtle pattern. If it was stained, by paint perhaps, or something worse, it might be at the bottom of the channel now." Sir Henry nodded, jotting a note. "I'll have the crew check the laundry and waste bins, though I doubt we'll find it. She's too clever for that. But this sister business, I'll look into Tommy's background, see what I can dig up." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the sea, where the waves shimmered in the fading light. "Be gentle with him, Henry. He's a boy caught in a storm not of his making. But Miss Finch, she's a different matter. Her composure is a mask, and I suspect it's hiding a rage that burned hot enough to act." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the Seraphina in twilight, Miss Marple returned to her chair. Her knitting resumed. The yacht was a maze of motives: Miss Finch's financial grudge, Tommy's personal vendetta, Clara's secretive pearls, Hargrove's evasions. Each was a thread, and Miss Marple, with her patient, unerring touch, was weaving them together, determined to reveal the truth before the voyage ended. Chapter 10. The Captain's Confession. The Seraphina remained anchored off the Isle of Wight, its decks bathed in the soft glow of evening lanterns as the sky deepened to a bruised purple. The guests, their nerves frayed by the unresolved mystery of Mr. Lionel Brent's disappearance, moved restlessly between the saloon and the open deck, their conversations clipped and cautious. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual wicker chair, her knitting a steady rhythm of clicks, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles, as she observed the subtle shifts in posture and glance that betrayed hidden truths. The yacht, once a haven of luxury, now felt like a chessboard. each player guarding their moves. And Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, was determined to checkmate the culprit. Sir Henry Clithering had spent the day pressing the crew for details, his Scotland Yard instincts honed by years of unravelling deception. His focus had settled on Captain Hargrove, whose vague logbook and guarded demeanour had raised suspicions from the start. Over a discreet lunch, Sir Henry confided in Miss Marple that he'd uncovered a discrepancy in the captain's account. A steward had seen Hargrove near the stern, not at the helm, moments before the scream that marked Brent's disappearance. Armed with this, Sir Henry resolved to confront him, and Miss Marple, sensing a pivotal moment, agreed to be present, her unassuming presence often loosening tongues where authority failed. They found Captain Hargrove in his cabin, a cramped but orderly space with charts pinned to the walls, and a brass compass gleaming on the desk. His weathered face was drawn, his navy blue uniform slightly rumpled, a far cry from the polished figure he'd cut at the voyage's start. He rose as they entered, his expression wary but resigned. "Sir Henry, Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff. "I assume this isn't a social call." "No, Captain," Sir Henry said, his tone firm but not unkind. "We need to talk about last night. Your logbooks are shambles, and your story doesn't add up. You said you were at the helm when Brent went over, but a steward saw you near the stern. Care to explain?" Hargrove's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking to the porthole as if seeking escape in the darkening sea. "I've told you what I know," he said, his voice low. "It was a busy night, guests everywhere. I might have stepped away for a moment, but I was back at the helm when the scream came." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her gaze gentle but unrelenting. "A moment can be a long time, Captain," she said, her voice as soothing as a village vicar's. "In my saint." Mary Mead, Mr. Wicks once claimed he was in his shop when a theft occurred, but a neighbour saw him elsewhere. Small discrepancies matter, you see, and your logbook, such vague entries for a man of your experience, almost as if you didn't want anyone to know where the Seraphina truly was. Hargrove's hands clenched, his knuckles white against the desk. For a moment, silence hung heavy, broken only by the distant lap of waves. Then, with a sigh that seemed to deflate him, he sank into his chair. "All right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I altered the log. Not because of Brent, mind you, but there was a customs patrol in the area. I took a detour to avoid them. We had some cargo, nothing illegal, but undeclared. Wine, mostly, for a private buyer. I didn't want the scrutiny Sir Henry's eyes narrowed. Undeclared cargo. That's a serious offence, Hargrove. And you thought hiding it was worth falsifying your log?" Hargrove's face flushed, a mix of shame and defiance. "I've a reputation to keep. A scandal like that could ruin me, but I swear it's got nothing to do with Brent. I saw him that night, arguing with Miss Finch near the starboard railing. He was red in the face, gesturing wild-like. She stood there, cold as ice, but I didn't hear what they said. After the scream, I was at the helm, organising the search. That's the truth." Miss Marple tilted her head, her needles pausing. "You saw Miss Finch with Mr. Brent then? And you didn't think to mention it earlier? In my village, Captain, people who withhold such details often have their own reasons. Fear, perhaps, or loyalty. Which is it for you?" Hargrove's eyes met hers, a flicker of respect in their depths. "Fear, I suppose," he admitted, "not of guilt, but of losing everything. This job, this ship, it's all I've got. I didn't push Brent, Miss Marple. I'd stake my life on it." She nodded, her expression unchanged. "I believe you're no murderer, Captain." "But secrets have a way of tangling things, don't they? Like a skein of wool knotted by careless hands." She resumed her knitting, her mind cataloguing his confession. The undeclared cargo explained his evasiveness, but it also muddied the waters, casting doubt on his reliability. And his sighting of Miss Finch, corroborating Tommy's account, tightened the net around her. Sir Henry jotted a note, his expression grim. "We'll verify this, Hargrove. If you're lying about the cargo or anything else, it'll come out. For now, stay available." He turned to Miss Marple, his voice low. "What do you make of it, Jane?" They stepped onto the deck, the evening air cool against their faces. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the starboard railing, where the red paint gleamed under the lanterns. "He's telling the truth, I think, about the cargo," she said softly. "But it's a distraction, Henry. His fear is real, but it's not the heart of this." Miss Finch was at the railing, seen by both Tommy and the captain. And her shawl, gone, perhaps discarded to hide a stain. "We're close, but we need more." Sir Henry nodded, his gaze following hers. "I'll press Finch again, and Clara. That necklace of hers is nagging at me. Too extravagant for a widow's grief. And Tommy's sister. I've sent a telegram to London to check her history with Brent." Miss Marple's lips pursed, her thoughts turning to the web of motives tightening around the Seraphina. Clara's pearls, Miss Finch's shawl, Tommy's sister, Hargrove's cargo. Each is a piece, Henry, but the picture is, don't they all fit together? She recalled Mrs. Tuttle's locked desk, where hidden letters revealed a scandal. Here, too, the truth was locked away, but Miss Marple was determined to find the key, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 11. The Gathering Storm. The Seraphina lay anchored under a sky streaked with the first hints of dusk. Its decks bathed in the soft amber glow of lanterns swaying gently in the evening breeze. The air was cool, carrying the tang of salt and the weight of suspicion that had grown heavier with each passing hour. The guests, their nerves stretched thin by the unresolved mystery of Mr. Lionel Brent's disappearance, moved with a restless unease, their conversations faltering like candles in a draught. Miss Jane Marple sat in her wicker chair at the upper deck, her knitting a steady cascade of wool, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles, as she observed the subtle dance of glances and gestures. The yacht, she felt, was a pressure cooker, and the truth, like steam, was ready to escape. The day had been one of quiet revelations. Captain Hargrove's confession about the undeclared cargo had clarified his evasiveness, but it had also deepened the web of secrets aboard the Seraphina. Miss Diana Finch's name surfaced repeatedly, tied to the heated argument with Brent and the missing shawl that Tommy Reed had seen her adjusting. Clara Brent's new pearls and her secretive visit to Hargrove's cabin hinted at motives yet unexplored, while Tommy's admission about his sister's connection to Brent added a personal thread to the tangle. Miss Marple, with her patient, unassuming air, had gathered these fragments, her mind weaving them into a pattern that was almost complete. As the dinner hour approached, Sir Henry Clithering proposed a gathering in the saloon, not a formal interrogation, but a chance to lay out the facts and observe the suspect's reactions. Miss Marple agreed, sensing that the pressure of confrontation might crack the polished facades that hid the truth. The saloon was prepared with its usual elegance: white linen, crystal glasses, and flickering candles, but the atmosphere was far from festive. The guests filed in, their faces a mix of apprehension and defiance. Clara Brent, her black dress offset by the gleaming pearls. Miss Finch, cool and composed in a tailored grey suit. Captain Hargrove, his uniform crisp but his eyes shadowed. And Tommy Reed, lingering at the edges, his tray of drinks trembling slightly. Sir Henry stood at the head of the room, his Scotland Yard authority tempered by a calm resolve. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying over the soft clink of glass, "we're here to discuss what happened to Mr. Brent. The Coast Guard has found no trace of him, and we must face the possibility that his fall was no accident. I've asked Miss Marple to share her observations, as she has a remarkable way of seeing things clearly." All eyes turned to Miss Marple, who set her knitting aside, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her expression was serene, but her gaze was as piercing as a needle. "Thank you, Sir Henry," she said, her voice soft but clear. "In my village of St. Mary Mead, I've learned that people are much the same, whether in a cottage or on a grand yacht like this. They carry their motives, greed, anger, fear, and sometimes those motives lead to desperate acts. Let us consider what we saw. I know," she paused, her eyes sweeping the room. "Mr. Brent was seen arguing with Miss Finch near the starboard railing, moments before the scream. Tommy Reed witnessed this, as did Captain Hargrove. The argument, I believe, was about a business deal, a merger that cost Miss Finch dearly. We found a letter in Mr. Brent's cabin, written by Miss Finch, threatening legal action. It was no idle threat, was it, Miss Finch?" Miss Finch's composure held, but her fingers tightened on her glass, a faint crack in her icy facade. "I've said before, Miss Marple, that my dealings with Brent were insignificant. A letter proves nothing but a moment of frustration. I was on deck, yes, but I left after our discussion. I heard the scream like everyone else." Miss Marple nodded, her smile gentle but unrelenting. "Of course, my dear. But Tommy saw you lingering at the railing, adjusting your shawl, a shawl that's now missing. And in Mr. Brent's cabin, we found a smudge of red paint, the same shade as the starboard railing. It's curious, isn't it, that the railing looks freshly painted, as if to hide something, a scuff perhaps from a struggle?" A murmur rippled through the room, and Clara Brent gasped, her hand flying to her pearls. "A struggle? You're saying someone pushed Lionel?" Her voice trembled, but Miss Marple noted the way her eyes darted to Miss Finch, a flicker of accusation in their depths. Miss Marple continued, her tone unchanged. "There's more. Tommy's sister worked for Mr. Brent and was dismissed under troubling circumstances. A photograph in his cabin suggests a closer connection, one that might have given Tommy a reason to watch him closely. Isn't that so, Tommy?" Tommy's tray clattered, his face paling. "I didn't do nothing, ma'am," he blurted, his voice cracking. "I told you, I just saw Miss Finch there, that's all. I swear it." "I believe you, Tommy," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing. "You're a good lad, caught in a difficult place. But your fear tells me there's more to this story." She turned to Clara, her eyes kind but probing. "And Mrs. Brent, your grief is understandable, yet your new pearls are a puzzle. A gift from your husband, you said. but so soon after his loss. And your visit to Captain Hargrove's cabin that night, what was that about, my dear?" Clara's face flushed, her fingers twisting the pearls. "How dare you!" she cried, her voice rising. "I was distraught, seeking comfort. The captain was kind, nothing more, and the pearls, Lionel gave them to me weeks ago." Her words were defiant, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of panic, like Mrs. Tuttle's when her secret letters were uncovered in St. Mary Mead. Captain Hargrove cleared his throat, his face grim. "I've admitted my mistake with the logbook," he said, his voice steady but strained. "I was avoiding a customs patrol, nothing more. I had no part in Brent's fall, and Mrs. Brent's visit was brief. She was upset, needed someone to talk to." Miss Marple's needles lay idle, her gaze moving from face to face. "Everyone has a story," she said softly, "but stories overlap, don't they? Miss Finch's anger, Tommy's fear, Mrs. Brent's pearls, the captain's secrecy, they all point to the starboard railing, where Mr. Brent went over. Someone knows what happened, and I believe that someone is here." The room grew still, the tension palpable. Miss Finch's composure cracked, her voice sharp. "This is absurd! You're weaving a tale from nothing. Paint, a shawl, a letter. Where's the proof?" Her eyes blazed, but her hands trembled, betraying her. Clara's sob broke the silence, her handkerchief pressed to her face. "I can't bear this. Lionel's gone, and you're all pointing fingers." Yet her tears, Miss Marple noted, were carefully timed, like a performance meant to deflect. Sir Henry stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "We're not accusing anyone, yet, but the facts are clear. Someone was at that railing, and someone knows more than they're saying. If you have anything to add, now's the time." The guests exchanged glances, their silence heavy with unspoken truths. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her eyes never leaving the room. The Seraphina was a storm about to break, and she was ready for the lightning to strike, revealing the truth in its fleeting, brilliant flash. Chapter 12. The Truth Revealed. The saloon of the Seraphina was a tableau of tension, the air thick with the weight of unspoken truths. As the guests sat in a semicircle of velvet chairs, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow of the chandeliers. The yacht, anchored under a sky now dark with the onset of night, seemed to hold its breath. The gentle lap of waves against the hull, the only sound beyond the faint creak of wood. Miss Jane Marple stood at the centre of the room, her slight figure in its modest tweed dress, an unlikely focal point, yet her presence commanded attention. Her knitting lay folded in her bag, her hands clasped before her, and her eyes, bright and piercing behind her spectacles, moved from face to face with the quiet certainty of a gardener spotting the root of a weed. Sir Henry Clithering stood beside her, his notebook tucked away, his Scotland Yard authority lending weight to the moment. The guests, Clara Brent, her pearls gleaming against her black dress, Miss Diana Finch, her grey suit as composed as her expression, Captain Hargrove, his uniform stiff but his face haggard, and Tommy Reed, hovering at the edge with a tray he barely held steady, waited in uneasy silence. The crew lingered near the doors, their eyes darting nervously, while the other guests, a mix of bankers and socialites, watched with bated breath. Miss Marple's voice, when she spoke, was soft but clear, cutting through the tension like a needle through cloth. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her tone as gentle as a saint. "Mary Mead afternoon. We have gathered here to unravel the tragedy of Mr. Lionel Brent's death. In my village, I've learned that truth often hides in plain sight, disguised by the ordinary. But here, on this splendid yacht, the ordinary is polished to a shine, and we must look beneath it." She paused, her gaze settling on Miss Finch, whose fingers tightened imperceptibly on the arm of her chair. "We know, Mr." Brent went over the starboard railing. Miss Marple continued. "After a heated argument with Miss Finch, witnessed by young Tommy Reed and Captain Hargrove. A letter in Mr. Brent's cabin, written by Miss Finch, spoke of a business deal, a merger that cost her millions. Such a loss, I think, would wound deeply, wouldn't it, Miss Finch? Like my neighbour, Mr. Finchley, who never forgave a debt that ruined his shop." Miss Finch's eyes flashed, her voice sharp but controlled. "I've admitted to the argument, Miss Marple, and the letter. But that's all it was. Business. I was angry, yes, but I didn't touch him. You have no proof otherwise?" Her composure held, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands, like a leaf caught in a breeze. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged. "Proof is a tricky thing, my dear. It's not always a fingerprint or a weapon. Sometimes it's the absence of something, like your shawl, the cream silk you wore that night. Tommy saw you adjusting it at the railing, as if hiding something, and now it's gone, isn't it? Perhaps thrown overboard, to conceal a stain, red paint perhaps, or something worse." A gasp rippled through the room, and Clara Brent's hand flew to her pearls, her face paling. "You're accusing her of murder?" she whispered, her voice trembling, though Miss Marple caught the flicker of calculation in her eyes, as if she welcomed the shift of focus. Miss Marple turned to Clara, her gaze kind but unrelenting. "Mrs. Brent, your grief is touching, but it puzzles me. Those pearls, so new and fine, hardly the choice of a widow in mourning. And your visit to Captain Hargrove's cabin before the incident, what was that about? Seeking comfort, you said, but the steward saw you leave in haste, adjusting your own shawl. Were you discussing more than your husband's temper?" Clara's lips parted, her voice rising in protest. "How dare you? I was distraught, nothing more. The captain was kind, that's all." But her hands twisted the pearls, and Miss Marple saw the fear beneath her indignation, like Mrs. Tuttle's when her secret letters were exposed. Captain Hargrove cleared his throat, his face flushed. "I've told you, Miss Marple, it was nothing improper. Mrs. Brent was upset about her husband's drinking. I listened, sent her on her way. My own mistake was the logbook. Avoiding customs, as I admitted, I had no part in Brent's death." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes moving to Tommy, who stood frozen, his tray trembling. "And you, Tommy, have been brave, telling us about your sister's dismissal by Mr. Brent. That photograph in his cabin suggests a closer tie, perhaps one that hurt her deeply. You watched him, didn't you? But I believe you when you say you didn't act. Your fear is of another's guilt, isn't it?" Tommy nodded, his eyes brimming. "I didn't do it, ma'am. I saw Miss Finch, like I said, at the railing after they argued. She looked wrong somehow." Miss Marple's voice grew firmer, her gaze returning to Miss Finch. "Let us piece it together, shall we?" Mr. Brent and Miss Finch argued, a feud born of a ruinous merger. You followed him to the starboard railing, Miss Finch, where the music drowned out voices. In a moment of rage, you pushed him, and he went over, his cry lost in the night. You repainted the railing to hide scuff marks, perhaps from his shoes or your own struggle. The red paint smudge in his cabin, where you went to ensure no evidence remained, confirms it. And your shawl, stained with paint or worse, was discarded into the sea. Miss Finch rose, her face pale, her voice a hiss. "This is preposterous!" A fairy tale spun from nothing. You have no body, no witness to this supposed push. I won't stand for it. Her hands shook, her composure shattering like glass. Clara sobbed, her handkerchief pressed to her face, but Miss Marple's eyes stayed on Miss Finch. "Rage is a powerful thing, my dear," she said softly. "In my village, Miss Elspeth once struck a man in anger, thinking it would go unnoticed. But truth has a way of surfacing, like a cork in water. You acted in a moment of desperation, didn't you? The merger wasn't just money. It was your pride, your future." Miss Finch's shoulders slumped, her voice breaking. "It was an accident," she whispered, tears welling. "He taunted me, laughed at my losses. I pushed him, not meaning to. He stumbled, fell over. I didn't know what to do. The paint, the shawl, it was panic to cover it up." Her confession hung in the air, a confession wrung from her by the weight of Miss Marple's quiet certainty. Sir Henry stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Miss Finch, you'll need to come with me. The authorities will be notified when we reach port." He signalled to a steward, who moved to escort her, her face now a mask of defeat. Clara's sobs grew louder, but Miss Marple noted the relief in her eyes, as if a burden had shifted. Tommy set down his tray, his face pale but resolute, while Hargrove stood silent, his confession of lesser sins now overshadowed. The guests murmured, their shock giving way to a grim acceptance. Miss Marple folded her hands, her work done. "People are much the same, everywhere," she said softly to Sir Henry, as the room emptied. "Their passions, their mistakes, they leave traces, if you know where to look." She gathered her knitting, her eyes on the sea, where the truth had finally surfaced as inevitable as the tide.